This is Cast of Wonders, the young adult fiction podcast featuring stories of the fantastic. Welcome. Episode 607. I'm Catherine Inskip, your editor and host. Our story for today is The Little Donkeys with the Crimson Saddles by Hugh Walpole, which was first published in the short story collection The Silver Thorn in 1928. Sir Hugh Seymour Walpole was a best-selling English novelist of the 1920s and 30s who chose a career in writing over following in his father's footsteps as a clergyman. He was a prolific writer from the publication of his first novel in 1909, The Wooden Horse, until his death in 1941. Producing 36 novels and 5 volumes of short stories across a wide range of genres and supporting many younger writers in their careers. Hugh Walpole was a gay man at a time when homosexuality was illegal, but he eventually settled down with his perfect friend in the Lake District. This story is narrated by Louise Hewitt. Louise Hewitt is enthusiastic about stories in all their forms. She is an advertising copywriter by day, a reader of bedtime stories in the evenings, and a D&D dwarf cleric at the weekends. Lou to her friends, she enjoys cooking up a storm, riding her bike in the rain, feeding ducks, doing yoga, and attempting to meditate. Her favourite stories are about dragons, but pirates and sea serpents are also good. She lives in London, United Kingdom, with her partner, her child on alternate weeks, and a very large ginger cat. And now, we've a tale to tell.
The Little Donkeys with the Crimson Saddles by Hugh Walpole. The little donkeys went past the shop window at 8 in the morning and 7:30 in the evening, punctually, rain or shine. Miss Pope christened them Percy and Emily. The old man, whose donkeys they were, she had long ago named Voltaire, because he looked wicked, unchristian, and clever, and because she liked literary allusions. One thing she often discussed with Miss Menzies, and that was why, being wicked and clever, he had not advanced further in the world. Miss Menzies suggested drink, and Miss Pope thought it probable. On the other hand, were it drink, he would for sure beat and abuse Percy and Emily, and this he did quite plainly not do, because they were both plump and well cared for. That might be, suggested Miss Menzies, that he had kept them in good condition to benefit his business. No one cared to ride skeletons. Miss Pope, who was very thin herself, said that stoutness did no one any good, and Miss Menzies, who was plump like the donkeys, replied that it was greatly a matter of God's will, although, as Miss Pope knew, she had no very good opinion of the deity, and often enough spoke of him sarcastically. Percy, Emily, Voltaire, Miss Pope, and Miss Menzies all lived in Silverton-on-Sea. When you say lived, Miss Menzies would sometimes impetuously exclaim, "You're putting it altogether too high. Exist is about the word." Miss Pope and Miss Menzies had existed together in Silverton for over 10 years now. They kept a shop of fancy work and antiquities. The fancy work was very new, the antiquities very old. The shop, when it was lucky, made a profit, and then they went away for a holiday. They had been to the Lake District, Paris, Vivi, the Isle of Man, and Lake Como. On the other years the shop had not made a profit. Miss Pope was 43 years of age, tall, bony, a jutting chin, kind, friendly eyes, reserved, sensitive. She loved Miss Menzies. Miss Menzies was 30, round, plump, short, dark pretty hair, also kind, friendly eyes, not at all sensitive, and she loved Miss Pope. But she loved Miss Pope less than Miss Pope loved Miss Menzies. She was, outwardly at least, more romantic and sentimental than Miss Pope. She thought often of men. Miss Pope never thought of them at all. Miss Menzies had no doubt but that very shortly she would be married. She had thought this now for 14 years. She had been once engaged, 10 years ago. That had been to a young man in the war, just after she had joined Miss Pope. But the young man had flirted with other girls. Only his fun, he'd assured her. Yes, but not mine, she'd replied. She had a hot temper when roused. Miss Menzies was the lively one. Miss Pope did the business. Miss Menzies was charming in the shop and sold many an article that the purchaser did not wish to buy. When she was gay, she was very gay. Her bad moods never lasted for long. But sometimes she would be deeply depressed. Was this to go on for ever and ever? Of course, she loved Miss Pope. But this stupid old town, this stupid old shop, this stupid, unnatural life. After all, a woman was meant to be married. Not every woman, said Miss Pope. Although, however, Miss Menzies was very gay with men, went to the local dances, smiled and laughed and delighted in compliments. She had a deep fastidiousness. Just anyone would not do. With everyone there was something the matter. The life was certainly monotonous. They lived in a little apartment above the shop. This apartment had 4 rooms, a sitting room, a bedroom, a bathroom and a kitchen. The rooms were tiny, but arranged with great taste. Miss Menzies loved possessions and cared deeply for the little Chippendale, half Chippendale bureau, the old gilt mirror, some prints from Ackermann's Microcosm, and the old French clock that had belonged to Miss Pope's grandfather. Miss Pope cared for these things too, but chiefly because Miss Menzies cared for them. The greatest fun they had was when they went on buying expeditions. They went to London, Canterbury, Winchester, any number of places. They had a little Morris Oxford, which they called after Miss Menzies' silly uncle Fortescue. The position of the shop was very agreeable. It possessed a charming Jane Austenish bow window, and looked onto the cobbled path that turned down to the sea. From the side windows the sea, in all its glories, its sulks, its rages, its comedies, was splendidly visible. In front of the bow window was the path, a small green common, and the house of a retired lieutenant colonel. Outside the shop hung a sign with a picture, beautifully painted, of an 18th century street. Over the door was painted in large blue letters, "The Serendipity Shop." No one knew what this meant, but it was out of Horace Walpole's letters. A very superior London bookseller who dealt only in ancient and priceless editions called his shop by this name. In the bow window were arranged a number of enchanting things: brass candlesticks, fire screens, pewter mugs, brightly coloured samplers, a silver ship, old paste brooches, necklaces and pins. Miss Menzies loved some of these things so much that it was agony for her to sell them. For the silver ship, indeed, she asked so impossible a price that it was still gloriously with her. Miss Pope and Miss Menzies never quarrelled, because Miss Pope refused to hear of such a thing. At times Miss Menzies would indignantly exclaim that Miss Pope had no feelings, but in her heart she knew that the opposite of this was true. Miss Pope's feelings were so deep that no trivial dispute was allowed to touch them. There were occasions when Miss Menzies wished passionately that Miss Pope didn't love her with such strength and obstinacy. It seemed nothing could shake Miss Pope's love for her, which made that love on occasion both unexciting and frightening. Miss Menzies felt she wasn't worthy of it. That she wasn't worthy of it was no fault of her own. Jane Pope had put all of her force into this one affection, while Alice Menzies allowed hers to spread out over 1,000 things. Over the silver ship, the Chippendale bureau, the Sealyham puppy next door, the curl of the sea as on a fine morning beyond the side window it slipped back from the shining road, the kindliness of Mrs. Masham the fruiterer, the jolly twin of young Mr. Hexton, with whom she often danced, the touching loneliness and devotion to duty of the 2 little donkeys. These and many, many other things drew from Alice little impulses of love and tenderness. What she needed was to meet someone who would draw out of her all this love and tenderness to one aim and object only. Unlike Jane, this someone must be a man. She thought that, after all these years, possibly at last this man had arrived. Mr. Hunting. Mr. Maurice Hunting. It was 20 minutes past 7 of a fine summer morning, and she was standing at the bow window, waiting for the donkeys to pass. Breakfast and the donkeys synchronized. 7:30 the year round. They would maybe have had their breakfast at 8 in winter time, had it not been for the donkeys. But because the donkeys did not relax, neither must they. Although really, when you thought of it, 7:30 in the morning was ridiculously early for the donkeys in the winter time. No clients would appear before 10, and how few in the winter in any case there must be. Miss Menzies walked sometimes to the long strip of smooth sand over whose shiny surface Percy and Emily carried their little charges, and on cold, wet days they would look desolate enough, standing bravely there on duty, with their faded crimson saddles and old Voltaire, crooked and bent and wicked, staring malevolently out to sea. No one in the world behaved more finely, more patiently, more decently than Percy and Emily, with their soft, sad eyes, their faint brown coats, their stubborn ears. Now, how was Miss Menzies going to behave? She stood there at the window, seeing all the colour, the faint blue sky like a bird's wing, the clear sparkling grass of the little green, the poplars over to the right of the Colonel's house, swaying musically in the morning breeze, and through the open window the hush-hush, stir-stir of the gentle morning sea. How was she going to behave? Last Tuesday Mr. Hunting had asked her to marry him, and today she was to give him her answer. She had said no word as yet to Jane Pope. Of course she would accept him. There would be no possible doubt. She would have accepted him last Tuesday, had not some strange, unreasoning caution warned her to wait just for a day or two. He was physically most attractive, the type she preferred. Not too young. He had told her that he was 36, broad and strong, his colour red-brown with health, hair and short toothbrush moustache black, not stout as yet, although he must take care of that, most neat and cleanly in appearance, by profession a doctor with a good practice in Bristol. He was, he told her, no longer a boy. He wanted a wife who would be a companion, a friend, who would help him in his work. And yet even as he spoke of these quite assured words, his voice had trembled. He had taken her hand and pressed it quite freely. There was a light in his dark eyes that seemed to speak of something more than mere desire for companionship. He had fine tastes, too, read the novels of Mr. Galsworthy and the works of Linton Strachey, admired the paintings of Sargent, and was a subscriber to the Bristol concerts. He was also a man who played golf, could sail a boat, loved dogs, and enjoyed watching rugby football. A many-sided man. He had thought, too, about life, considered that wars were shameful and must be stopped. Was a patriot, too, and thought Bolshevism an infernal crime. Did not go to church, but yet had religious feelings. Of course she would marry him. He was the very man for whom she had so long been waiting. And yet, was she truly in love? Why, at this moment, as she looked out onto the shining grass and heard the rustle of the sea, was she not longing to be caught into his arms? Why was it rather of Jane Pope that she was thinking, and of all the little things that had seemed to her for so long to be tiresome, intolerable hindrances, binding her to slavery? Why? Ah! There were the donkeys. They turned the corner, as they always did, at a little trot. Then, when they came to the stretch of flat with the gleaming green on their right, they made a movement in the direction toward it, and then Voltaire, as he always did, switched them back to their proper place. They paused opposite the bow window before resigning themselves to their inevitable duty. Their crimson saddles, faded long ago with the wind and the rain, gave them their unusual note. Once those saddles must have been grand indeed with their splendid rich colour. Even now there was colour enough to place them in a class by themselves. No other donkeys anywhere had saddles like these. Miss Menzies leaned out of the window and waved to them. Percy and Emily looked neither to the right nor to the left. Patiently, with childish dignity, they stared down the road. Then, after a switch of Voltaire's little stick, on they trotted again. "Breakfast ready!" cried Miss Pope from the room above. Miss Menzies, sighing, turned away from the window. The moment had arrived. She must deal with it as honestly as she could. The little sitting room was very gay in the morning sun. The Ackerman prints smiled behind their glass. The sampler on the wall, with its purple flowers and its Jane Bowl made to this in amber letters. Everything welcomed Alice Menzies, when indeed she did not want to be welcomed at all, but sat down like a condemned prisoner to her herring. And Jane Pope at once knew. When you love anyone as deeply as she loved Alice Menzies, you know everything. "What's the matter, Alice?" she asked in her sharp, kind, rather masculine voice. "You know Mr. Hunting?" began Alice Menzies. "Yes," said Jane Pope, who had met him once. "He asked me to marry him last Tuesday. Today I'm to give him my answer. Well, of course I'm going to accept him." Jane Pope put down her cup. Alice knew she was trembling. She knew it, although she did not look at her. She did not dare look at her. But Jane Pope's voice was quite firm when she said, "I'm very glad, darling. It's what I've been wanting for you." Then, after another pause, she got up, went over to Alice Menzies' chair, bent over and kissed her. Alice put up her hand and touched Jane Pope's cheek. They stayed for a moment thus. Then Jane Pope, moving back to her seat again, said, "I expect that American woman will be in this morning after those 2 chairs. She's got bargains there." "She has indeed," said Alice Menzies, and that was every word that they exchanged on the matter. Should not one be happy when one is going to fulfill the desire of one's heart? The sun is shining, the waters are rolling white-capped on the shore, the skylark is singing above the cornfield, the air is warm with summer scents. It is the day after the heart of all the poets from Syracuse and Theocritus to Mr. Wordsworth of Grasmere. In the hollow of the cliff, high over the shore, glittering now mother of pearl behind the retreating tide, cornfields behind him, wine-purple sea in front of him, Mr. Hunting, passion in his heart and a ring, charming in excellent taste, 3 little pearls and a thin gold band, in his pocket, is waiting. Below him are bathing tents, maidenly in a row like early Victorian ladies. To the left of him, along the broad stretch of sand, Percy and Emily, their crimson saddles invisible from this distance, are trotting under their infant burdens. Above him the cornfields like burnt sugar, everywhere happiness and life and colour. Only Miss Menzies advancing in a dress of pink and white. He had no doubt of what the answer would be. He was well satisfied, a state not uncustomary for him. This was all that he needed. A lady, pretty, cultivated, with good taste, to manage his house, charm his friends, assist the growth of his practice, share his bed, and bear him 2 children. 2, a boy and a girl. Percy, after his uncle, who, when he died, would leave him money, and Emily after his aunt, who had left him some money already. He would take that house toward Clifton, the house with the veranda and the garage near the gate. He would... Alice as she sat down beside him, wished, oh, how she wished, that he had not chosen this spot in which to make his proposal. Had she thought of it? But when does one think of these things? There could not possibly be anywhere worse. Here, where she could see all the familiar things, the little town white and shining in the sun, huddled together so happily as though cosily inviting her congratulation, she so old a friend at its contentment, the great sweep of purple green-striped sea, the silver beach, the cornfields and the singing larks, yes, and then, surely she could see them quite clearly, Percy and Emily, trotting bravely, little midgets of patience and determination, to their inevitable destiny. She had hated all these things. She had regarded them as tyrants, holding her to sterility, old maidhood, failure and negation. But how differently they seemed now she was about to leave them. And the shadow of Jane's nobility, kindliness and love, the touch of her cheek, the unselfish fidelity of her soul, Jane's shadow hung over all the scene. Turning to Mr. Hunting, she was forced to confess that he was noble too. Sitting forward, staring at the sea, square and strong and so very masculine, he seemed indeed a rock, not a rock of Jane's less romantic kind, a masculine rock with masculine allure. His voice, too, was extremely firm and decided. "Alice," he said, "I thought you were never coming. I didn't know how I was going to wait. It has been cruel of you to keep me so long in doubt." He took her hand in his. She expected her heart to bound with excitement and joy. It did not. But that was because her eye had been caught by the shining spire of St. John's Church. St. John's, where, indeed, she very seldom went, whose bells, however, seemed to belong to her, to be hers by right of every tiny happening of the last 10 years. I mean, she hesitated. "I've been thinking a great deal of what you said. It was kind of you to give me a day or two. That was only fair. You wanted a little time, and so I gave it you. If you'd been my patient, and you'd wanted a day or two to consider whether you'd have an operation, I'd give you time. Of course I would. This is a sort of operation, you know." He laughed in a very jolly human way, but she knew at once that her sense of humour was not his. She would never laugh at the things that he would laugh at. Or was it just that her eye now had travelled to the cluster of red house roofs that sheltered, as she so thoroughly knew, the market-place? The market-place where on Fridays all the farmers, the dogs, the sheep— "Well, darling," his firm voice reminded her, "I want my answer." Gently, but firmly, he put his arm around her and drew her close to him. She could smell the stuff of his coat and the scent of his rather strong tobacco. His heart was beating with steady beats. His body, as she realised her contact with it, seemed to be made of iron. "I want," she said, in a small, faltering voice, and her eye now had caught the flag that always flew so bravely in the season from the tower of the little building, the plaza it was called, where the concerts, the dances, the lectures were held. "To try and explain." "To explain?" His hand tightened on hers. "Why, of course, explain away." "You see," the flag on the plaza seemed to be waving quite especially in her direction, "I'm not a child any longer. It isn't as though either of us were children." "Quite," he said, encouraging her. The flag above the plaza seemed to tell her that he had said quite a great many times the other day. "And one knows more about life than one did when one was very young, and so one's more cautious of making a change." "Quite." And one's got fixed into a sort of groove, hard to get out of." "Quite," he said, as she paused. "What I mean is, I'm not sure even now, after you're so kindly giving me these days to think it over, whether I really love you enough, "Of course you do," he answered, laughing the laugh of victory. "Don't you think I could tell it the first moment we met?" "Oh, but I don't think I did love you the first moment we met. Really, you're a little wrong there. Of course, I liked you, but liking is very different from love, isn't it?" "Quite," he assured her. Yes, it was different. She knew it as her eyes moved down the line of roofs, all sparkling now like lumps of quartz in the sun, down to the lower, irregular circle of chimneys and windows that covered just the ground, where for 10 years herself and Jane Pope had been living. She knew, with a sudden, passionate burst of revelation, that she loved that ground, that there, exactly there, where gathered together were the chimney pots, the bow windows, tables and chairs, pots and pans, dresses hanging on hooks, rows of shoes in cupboards, squares of green grass, thousands and thousands of pebbles, fires and streamers of smoke, eggs on the boil, books behind glass, white enamelled bars and the Ackerman prints. Just there, with their confused collection of oddities, her heart was stirred and moved as, oh, most certainly not, it was not stirred and moved by Mr. Hunting. In her distress she turned toward him, and at once Silverton, the beach, the fields, the sea, the sky, were excluded, and instead there was Mr. Hunting, filling all the horizon. Mr. Hunting so close she could see the red veins of his cheeks, the short, sharp bristles of his moustache. As she turned to him, he caught her to him and kissed her. "There," he said, "that settles it." Had he but kissed her and said nothing about it, it might have been done. She liked the kisses, if truth be told, extremely. But the words offended her liberty. "Oh, no, no," she cried, "it hasn't." And her heart cried out to the shining roofs, to the gleaming beach, to the white-capped sea to come and defend her. In a moment she was going to yield. His physical presence was too eliminating. She wanted to be loved by a man, to fling aside her old maidhood forever, to be as other women, full of life's experience, as a living, consciously completed woman. But, oh, she didn't want to marry Mr. Hunting, to exchange Mr. Hunting for Jane, to suffer his masculine cocksureness, his arrogance, his lack of imagination, to change Bristol and his dull doctor's house, the monotonous routine of his uninteresting friends, his male self-satisfaction, for Jane's beauty of heart, her lovely imagination, for the silver ship, the little things of the shop and the flat, the friends, the beloved little town, with its crooked streets, its intimate shops, its salty air, its shining reaches of sand and sea. Oh no! Oh no! But she was yielding. Mr. Hunting now had caught her very close to himself. He had kissed her again and yet again, and now he was telling her all about himself, all about his childhood, how he had been considered always the promising one of the family, how his mother had always said he would go far, and his Uncle Percy, who was also a doctor. Percy, thought Alice Menzies, and her soul for an instant escaped the snarer. Her eyes fled outwards, downwards. She saw the sand now blazing under the sun, and there, brave little heroes, there they were, trotting for their very lives, Voltaire, a black doll, running at their sides. His Uncle Percy, seeing his ability, had promised to help him. So, indeed, he'd gone from strength to strength, done well at Bart's, he'd played half-back for the hospital football team, stayed on there as surgeon, then found a small practice in Lambeth, been there a year or two when his Aunt Emily— "Emily!" cried Alice Menzies' soul, and once more she escaped. Now her eyes were fixed on this broad stretch of sand, and she could see how her little friends had come to the end of their journey there, far, far little black toys in the glittering sun. His Aunt Emily, admiring him as she did, had helped him with money, and he had brought the practice at Bristol. Here he'd gone from strength to strength. He might be said, without undue vanity, he hoped, to be now the most promising doctor in Bristol. People were coming to him from all sides. Why, only last week. Here he apologised, lest he should seem to be boasting. He kissed her again. Her soul was caught again. She wanted to be kissed. She wanted to be loved. And so, he assured her, she would have a wonderful time. He would buy this splendid house with 10 bedrooms, garden, garage, tennis court. There she should entertain his friends. He knew all the best people in Bristol. And then he caught her yet closer to himself. He knew she would want children. She was that kind of woman. He couldn't love a woman who didn't want children. 2, he thought, would be a nice number. Not more than 2 in these days when living was so costly. A boy and a girl would be splendid if they only had the luck. She was sinking. Her heart was beating against his. Her hair brushed his cheek. A boy and a girl. And he thought, if they were so fortunate, it would be jolly to call them Emily, after the aunt who had been already good, and Percy, after the uncle who shortly, because he was now 72 and had a weak heart, would be good also. Percy and Emily! Her heart pounded. She was seized with a hysterical passion of laughter. Percy and Emily! She was out of his arms and standing there looking down to the sea and cried, "Oh no! Don't you see? This ridiculous coincidence. Oh, it's too funny. It's terribly funny. Percy and Emily. But those are the names of the donkeys. Jane and I have always called them so. And our children, yours and mine. What a silly coincidence. Oh, I'm so sorry. Forgive me." For she saw in the very middle of her laughter that he was offended, terribly offended. "Donkeys? Donkeys are children?" he repeated, staring at her as though she'd gone suddenly mad. "Yes, I know." Her breath was coming in little gasps. "It's the coincidence. There never was anything so absurd. I can never explain, and if I did, you'd never see it. It's only that there are 2 donkeys, 2 dear little donkeys." "2 dear little donkeys!" he exclaimed. "Forgive me if I don't see the joke. I was speaking to you more seriously than I've ever spoken to anyone in my life, speaking of the most serious things a man and woman can speak of, and, oh, I know." She couldn't now at all control herself. "I know how shocking it is. I'm ashamed I can't stop. It's so silly. Our children, you're so solemn about them, and then Percy and Emily running about down there." He was growing angry. She saw in a flash that he would be angry whenever his vanity was hurt. "Please explain. I'm sorry if I'm slow. I was talking about our children. That seems a joke to you. I don't understand." "Oh, no, it isn't a joke. Of course they aren't a joke." She was struggling to control herself. "It's because for ever so long Jane and I have watched 2 donkeys pass our window, and their names are Percy and Emily." She paused for breath. "Really, Miss Menzies?" Yes, now he was deeply insulted. "I think you don't understand me. I've always imagined a proposal of marriage was a serious affair, something—" Oh, it is, terribly serious. But that's the worst of it. Ridiculous things are always breaking into life. And if people don't see the same ridiculous things, don't think the same ridiculous things, well, they oughtn't to marry. I know they oughtn't." "But forgive me, how can I see what's ridiculous when you won't tell me?" "No, but you'd never see, and Jane always sees. She loves the donkeys just as I do." "But what donkeys?" Yes, now he was just mostly in a rage. "What have these donkeys, whatever they are, to do with our marriage?" Nothing at all. I apologise terribly. It was the coincidence that our children should have the same name as your uncle and your aunt. Life is so funny. We're so absurd. And if you don't see how absurd we are, it wouldn't do for us to marry. Really, it wouldn't. I'm sorry," she went on with a pang of misgiving. "I've behaved abominably. You can't forgive me, and you're right." She came to him, bent forward, and gently kissed his forehead. "You've been very good to me. You've paid me a great compliment. but it would never, never do. And turning, she left him. At first, she scarcely knew the way she went. Then everything stole out and around her, the green slope of the hill over whose breast the late afternoon shadows were now falling, the thick, dark coolness of the oaks, the bright colour of the path that led down to the town, the great sweeps of purple shadow that now lay like islands upon the breast of the violet sea. Above all, the sky that glittered with light and into whose great field of faintly rose pearl a piled-up cumulus of ivory cloud was now mounting. She slipped into the little house. The green shutters had been put up over the bow window. She ran straight up to the sitting-room. The lamp with the ivory parchment shade was lit. The table was spread for supper. The French clock struck the quarter. Jane Pope, who was standing at the window, turned. Alice, waiting at the door, cried, "Jane, I refused him." "No, no, no! Yes, yes, yes! It never would have done. He had no sense of humour. He suggested, oh, Jane, just think of it, that our children, when we had them, should be called Percy and Emily." Percy and... Yes, he didn't know, of course, about our Percy and Emily. How should he? Oh, but I laughed and he was offended and, oh, there you are. It never would have done. And everything in the room repeated, it never, never would have done. She ran to Jane Pope, clung to her. "Oh, Jane, I didn't know. I had never guessed. How good, how sweet all this time you've been." So Jane, who had waited for many years, most patiently had her great moment. They stood at the window looking out. The sea lay milky white, like the smoky glass of a mirror. The sun, very low, lit the green on the other side of the path with a fierce flame. Everything was as still and as gently coloured as a bed of crocus. Suddenly there was a jingle. "The donkeys!" cried Alice. "They're before their time." Round the corner they came. Under the window, as usual, they stopped. Then, attracted perhaps by the light of the lamp that was pale against the evening sun, Percy looked up. For an instant, his patient, friendly eyes gazed into theirs. Then, with a twitch of his ear, he turned with Emily hopefully toward the grass. Once again, as on 1,000 earlier days, they were disappointed, and bending their heads in submission, trotted away around the corner toward home.
Although this story doesn't have any speculative elements in the usual sense, we thought it was very much in keeping with the stories we usually publish. Lesbian relationships were always much more tolerated than male homosexuality in the past, mostly due to some very heteronormative and patriarchal ideas of what sex is and what it is not. But the social stigma remained. A relationship with another woman was perceived as a failing to secure a more appropriate match. There's a sense in this story that both women know that they can only push back so far against societal expectations at the expense of their mutual happiness. But when the question is finally asked, Miss Menzies eventually realises that happiness is all that matters, and how much of a happy relationship she already shares with Miss Pope. It's a delightful story, especially in the context of the author's times. Join us again soon. We love bringing you the best audio fiction week after week, but we can't do it without your support. Your donations pay our authors, our narrators, our servers and our staff. Please consider supporting us with a monthly donation through either PayPal or Patreon. You can also review us on Apple Podcasts, request us on Spotify, and consider the stories we publish for award consideration. There are lots of ways you can help. Join the discussion on the EA Discord or on social media at Cast of Wonders. Come say hello. Cast of Wonders is brought to you by editor Catherine Inskip, assistant editor Alicia Caparasso, associate editors Rebecca Arn, Tanya Aidlit, Amy Brennan, Sobto Ahesway, Cup Jacob, Becca Miles, Ray O, Samuel Poots, Pooja Prakabaran, Emma Smales, Denise Sudell, and Rin Yi. Our editorial assistant is Amy Brennan, our community manager is Denise Sudell, and our audio producer is Jeremy Carter. Cast of Wonders is part of the Escape Artists Foundation, a a 501c3 non-profit, and this episode is distributed under the Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License. That means you can download or listen to the episode on any device you like, but you can't change it or sell it. Our theme music is Appeal to Heavens by Alexei Nov, available from Promo DJ or his Facebook page. Thank you for listening.